Hi, and welcome to the video manual for my second plugin, Ridgewalk. My name is Akil, and I'm the human behind Akil Adam Sound. Whether you're already familiar with my first plugin, Weeping Wall, or you're brand new to my work, I'm very excited to introduce this tool and show you how it works. Firstly, what is Ridgewalk? Ridgewalk is a plugin for macOS, Windows, and iOS, and comes in VST3, AU, and clap formats. Ridgewalk is a sort of granular looper. It's a hybrid between a micro looper and a granular synth. At a high level, audio gets recorded or imported into one long buffer. From there, a swarm of micro loopers play back from various points in the buffer. You get to define where those loopers are positioned, how those loops move through the sample, and through this technique, you can reimagine whatever audio you put through Ridgewalk. It's composed of three main sections. The buffer section defines how audio is captured, how long the buffer is, the recording technique, and how overdubbing happens. The looper section controls the micro loopers playing back from the sample. This section controls everything except the position of the loopers. It controls their size, their pitch, the number of them, and more. The traversal section determines how the loopers are positioned in the buffer and how they move through the sample over time. Do they wander around randomly? Do they move linearly in a predictable way? Or maybe they're controlled by some external input. You can see that the UI is broken up into these three sections, and everything you need to get up and running is right here on the front panel. However, this is a tabbed UI, and you can dive into each section for more advanced controls if you choose. We'll get into each section in detail in just a moment. There are also some top-level controls as well, for playing or pausing, reversing, or clearing the audio. There's also independent dry and wet controls for flexible configuration. Let's start with the buffer section. Audio can be brought into Ridgewalk in two primary ways, by recording or by sample loading. Let's start with recording. There are two recording techniques at your disposal in Ridgewalk. For either technique, you'll first have to choose a buffer size, which can be defined either in seconds or as a musical increment. You can change that here. Let's make that seconds. You can also overdub your recording as much as you want, and you can rewind time and scan through your previous recordings with the layer control as well. Furthermore, recording is possible while reversed too. The default recording mode is called auto recording, and it starts recording automatically when the input meets a certain threshold volume. You can set that volume here with the threshold knob. If you're a Weeping Wall user, this will be very familiar to you. There's an indicator on the knob showing the current volume of the incoming audio. When that audio meets the threshold, recording starts. One advantage of this mode is that it lets you be more hands-off with Ridgewalk, and you can let it record automatically as you improvise or jam. Once the initial recording is made, you can start overdubbing over it to create a new layer. Auto recording by default is paired with a traditional feedback overdub. When a recording is started, the previous layer's volume is reduced by the percentage on the feedback control, similar to an analog delay or traditional looper. The second recording mode is called classic recording. This is more of a classic latching control reminiscent of a traditional looper. The recording can be started and stopped as you see fit, and Ridgewalk will continue recording as long as it's active. Notably, once you reach the end of the first buffer, Ridgewalk will automatically start overdubbing, and it will continually overdub until you stop recording. Let's see that in action. Because this mode can record infinitely, it's paired with a different overdubbing technique by default. This overdubbing mode is called the sidechain mode, and rather than reducing the original buffer by a certain volume, it compresses the original signal based on the new incoming signal. In effect, the original audio is only reduced and replaced if and when you actually record new signal. This overdub process is smart, and Ridgewalk won't commit a recording if it detects that nothing was recorded. As a result, it's safe to leave Ridgewalk recording as long as you want, and sound will only be replaced if there's something to replace it with. You can see here I've started recording, but I'm not actually playing anything, so the buffer doesn't change. This mode is particularly well suited to preserving the musicality of a phrase. For example, if your buffer length is set to 2 bars, recorded content will be at the place in the bar when you record. If this is important to you, I think this is the mode for you. This overdubbing mode also tends to accumulate sound throughout the buffer, so it's well suited for building up denser atmospheres. Furthermore, by default, this recording mode is synced to your transport, so it starts and stops recording automatically when your DAW's transport starts or stops. But you can disable this in the settings menu if you prefer. There's also a parameter available that directly controls recording if you would prefer to do something like MIDI map this button or automate it or whatever you want to do with it. As I mentioned before, each time you overdub, you'll create a new layer. You can see these layers start to cascade back into infinity. If you want to revert the buffer to a previous version, you can do so using the layer control here. The loopers will smoothly and instantly transition over to the selected layer, and this can be really nice for moving between different iterations of your sound. Please note though, if you're reverted to a previous layer and start recording from there, overdubbing will happen on top of that layer, and you will lose the layers that came after that original layer. The third way of introducing audio into Ridgewalk is by loading a file. Ridgewalk should be able to handle pretty much any file that you throw at it, and you can either click this button to open a file picker, or you can simply just drop a sample right into the interface. In this mode, the buffer size, recording, overdub, layer will all be disabled. And finally, there's also a hold time control. Whenever a recording is made, Ridgewalk will automatically start playback. The hold time defines how long the playback will run after starting. By default, it runs infinitely, sort of like a traditional looper, but you can also reduce the hold time to have Ridgewalk behave more like a strange delay or reverb. Let's hear that in action. So you can see that the hold time is taking effect, and soon after playback starts, it automatically stops. You might also notice that as soon as you start recording, Ridgewalk will begin playback. If you'd like Ridgewalk to behave more like a traditional looper and only start playback once you've finished recording the whole buffer, you can turn off instant playback here in the settings menu. Okay, so now that we know how Ridgewalk records audio, let's talk about how Ridgewalk generates audio. Audio output comes from the looper section, which controls a swarm of granular micro loopers that play back from your recorded buffer. Playback is generated by these loopers, which can move around the buffer and explore different nooks and crannies of the sound you recorded. As you might have noticed, the UI shows a kind of mountain range that roughly shows the current positions of the loopers and their relative amplitudes. This ridge line in the UI shows where the loopers are currently positioned and where they're kind of accumulating. The most basic control here is size. This controls the size of all of the loopers in tandem. If we change that, we can immediately see in the UI that we're now covering a larger part of the buffer. We make these quite small, they'll move quicker, and we'll cover less of the buffer. By default, loopers are defined in terms of seconds, but you can also switch that over and have them defined as a musical increment. The next control here is called blur. This primarily affects the crossfade between loops, which can blur subsequent loops together to make the output more ethereal. Furthermore, beyond 50%, a reverb is introduced of increasing size and intensity, which can really enhance the effect of smearing together all of the loops into one homogeneous sound. Can really hear that reverb. Let's dial that back down. Below 50%, we're affecting how loops crossfade into each other. You can really hear the hard edge of the loops now. Increasing this is basically one knob control for increasing ambience and really smearing everything together. In the loopers section, we have access to a few more controls as well. There's an amount control, which controls how many loopers are actually playing. You can have up to 7, and please note that all of the loopers will move together through the buffer. We can also change the pitch of the playback. We can change that pitch from plus or minus 2 octaves. There's also a drift control, which adds a bit of randomness. This applies to the looper size and the looper positioning. It lets each looper deviate and kind of desynchronize from each other. By default, this is turned on a little bit just to kind of make each repetition and loop a little bit more interesting. Each looper is able to repeat in a totally asynchronous way from one another. And this is a nice way to just kind of add some divergence and a bit of interesting variations to your ear. And in concert with that, there are also a couple of random changes that you can apply to loops. You can have loops randomly skip. This can kind of create a more choppy or more just divergent sound that kind of breaks things up. If we introduce a bit of reverb, this can be cool. And then there's also a random volume control, which kind of applies a random volume adjustment to each of the loops. This can further add just a little bit of variation and help break things up. And finally, we have the traversal section, which controls where the loopers are positioned in the buffer and how they move around the buffer over time. There's a number of options here for how loopers can behave. When Ridgewalk is running, you might notice a little indicator moving around. There it is. That is your indicator that is showing you where the movement control is currently pointing the loopers to be. When the primary first looper completes its current loop, it will move to the position of the traversal section for its next loop. As a result, you can see it kind of following the traversal, but it also kind of deviates exactly from that position. The shorter the loopers are, the quicker they'll keep up with traversal. But longer loopers will complete loops less frequently, so they will update to the position of traversal less frequently. The additional loopers will follow the primary looper, so they all kind of follow the traversal in tandem. As a result, they move around the sample, but the motion is dependent on the number of loopers, the size of them, and that'll determine how accurately they sync to the position or how laissez-faire they are with following traversal. There's a handful of ways to move through the buffer sequentially. We're currently using the forward option, which is fairly implicit. The traversal section moves from the start to the end of the buffer linearly in the defined time. This time can be synced, or it can be defined in seconds. There's also a backward option, which does the opposite. We'll move from the end of the sample to the start of the sample. And there's also a ping pong mode, which will go from the start of the sample to the back of the sample to the start of the sample, back and forth. There's also a random mode called wander. The position will move back and forth randomly via Brownian motion and kind of wander the length of the sample. This can kind of let you really explore different parts of the buffer unpredictably and kind of create something that really morphs in an unpredictable way over time. At the highest setting, this becomes pretty much entirely random if you want your loopers to just kind of come from any old place in the sample. There's also a manual mouse click mode, which lets you click directly on the buffer to decide where you want your loopers to go. In the other modes, there's also a start and end position, which can limit the boundaries that the loopers can traverse. If you really want to just dial in a specific section of this buffer, this can be particularly useful if, say, you're importing a long file and you want to just explore a certain region of it. Finally, since the traversal section also deals with how loopers are positioned and how they change over time, there is a control for the spread of the loopers. When you introduce more than one looper, the spread control lets you change how far apart they're positioned. This can let you explore a broader part of the sample at once. Or you can have your loopers pretty much entirely overlap and create a really phased sound. And finally, you can control the fade time, which takes effect when you play or pause the transport. You can see there's a nice long tail there now. All right, let's get into some suggested usages for Ridgewalk. The first is one of my favorites. It's kind of a pseudo time stretching algorithm. You can use Ridgewalk as a sort of granular time stretching device. If you use forwards traversal, you will navigate through the recorded content either quicker or slower than the original version of it. In this case, my buffer is 1 bar, and I'm going to traverse through the sample over 2 bars. So let's hear what that sounds like. So we're hearing something pretty accurate to the original sample, but it's stretched out to twice as long. We can also do the reverse. We can blow through the sample quicker than the original. If you want to do something like this, shorter loopers are going to be your friend, as they'll keep up to date with the traversal position a little bit more accurately. It can also be fun to add a little bit of drift here to kind of change each repetition and each time through. This is also really interesting because you can basically do it in real time and even repitch if you want. Another one of my favorite ways to use Ridgewalk is using it to generate kind of an infinite soundscape from whatever you feed it. I like to use the wander control here. Maybe a moderate speed and a pretty high blur setting. And here I can record whatever into it. And Ridgewalk will just kind of wander around this sample and create a really infinite soundscape. The blur setting and drift setting are definitely your friends here. You might want to use many loopers. You can reverse the signal to really shave any attack off. Maybe a little random volume. And I find this is really interesting to kind of create something complementary to whatever you're performing. And I also think this is interesting if you want to kind of incorporate the timbre of a sound, for example, a choir or strings or woodwinds. You just want that timbre in the background of a piece, but you're not necessarily sure how to fit it in. I really like recording those sounds into Ridgewalk and letting it just kind of provide that texture. And finally, you can try using Ridgewalk as a kind of false reverb. We heard a bit of this sound earlier, but let's check it out again. I'm going to use a relatively small looper size. I'm going to turn off the instant playback. Maybe make wander really random. We're going to drop our hold time so that Ridgewalk just kind of chimes in after everything you record. And we're going to use a pretty short buffer size here. And check this out. You can change the fade time to really dial this in. So this creates almost a automatic pad after every little thing you do. Okay, that's all from me. I hope this video helps demystify Ridgewalk, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for your support. You can find links to purchase or trial Ridgewalk in the description below.